Flight attendant slaps pregnant woman, not knowing she's married to a judge. Welcome, dear viewers, to a thrilling tale that crackles with suspense, mystery, and unexpected turns. In this epic story, a seemingly routine flight becomes the stage for shocking encounters, deep secrets, and dramatic showdowns. A pregnant woman boards her plane with no idea that a single moment will place her directly in the path of a ruthless flight attendant. Little does anyone suspect that her husband, who happens to be a respected judge, will be drawn into a whirlwind of conflict and long-buried mysteries. Prepare yourselves for a journey full of tension, twists, and karmic justice. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. If you enjoyed the video, press 1. If not, press O. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. At precisely 6:45 a.m., the bustling terminals of John F. Kennedy International Airport buzzed with a combination of early morning fatigue and nervous energy. Hundreds of travelers scurried between gates, juggling suitcases, coffee cups, and last-minute phone calls. In the midst of this organized chaos stood a gentle-faced, visibly pregnant woman named Clara Martin, who clutched her boarding pass for Transaero Flight 972 bound for Los Angeles. What most of the swirling crowd failed to notice was the anxious glance Clara kept throwing over her shoulder every few seconds, as though she feared someone might be following her. The icy morning wind seeped into the terminal through the sliding doors, sending a shiver down her spine. She brushed her scarf aside and tried to steady her breathing, determined to board without incident. Little did she know, fate had other plans for her that day, and her entire life was about to transform in ways she could never have imagined. Seated near the same gate, a flight attendant named Miranda Shaw methodically scrolled through her phone. Tall, sharp-featured, and possessed of an unwavering air of authority, she was known by her colleagues for her strict adherence to regulations. She prided herself on maintaining an impeccably polished uniform and a laser-focused commitment to her job, even if that meant coming across as unyielding or cold. Miranda's somewhat frosty demeanor had stirred rumors among the crew that she had left behind a turbulent personal life to pursue her career in the skies. Few people understood why Miranda was perpetually on edge. Fewer still knew of her knack for pushing certain passengers beyond their limits. That morning, her eyes glinted with a barely contained frustration that radiated to anyone passing by. Like Clara, Miranda, too, was about to step onto the stage of a larger drama, though she had no inkling that she was mere hours away from committing an act she'd later regret. As luck would have it, Clara boarded early due to her pregnancy, eager to secure her overhead baggage space and get settled into her seat near the front of the plane. Despite her outward calm, Clara's heart pounded with a nervous anticipation. Her husband, Judge Thomas Martin, a rising star in the judicial circuit, had planned to accompany her on this trip. A last-minute legal complication delayed his arrival at the airport, so Clara was left to board alone. Her mind a flurry of questions. Would Thomas make it on time? Would she have to travel by herself? For reasons she couldn't fully articulate, her anxiety escalated. She could not have guessed that this heightened state of tension would prove to be both a curse and a curious sort of blessing. Once Miranda Shaw noticed her. Moments before the cabin doors were to close, Clara's relief soared as she spotted Thomas hurrying down the aisle, breathless from sprinting through security. Although Thomas tried to maintain an air of judicial composure, small beads of sweat dotted his forehead. He flashed a reassuring smile at Clara, gave her a quick embrace, and lowered himself into the seat next to hers. He apologized repeatedly for cutting it so close, explaining that he had been finalizing paperwork for a high-profile case. His words trailed off, however, when he saw the look of unease etched across Clara's features. In that fleeting exchange, neither recognized the cosmic twist that had placed them on a collision course with Miranda Shaw's volatile temper. The aircraft began to taxi away from the gate, lights blinking against the pre-dawn gloom. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming passengers aboard and outlining the approximate 5-hour flight time. Clara closed her eyes, momentarily soothed by the gentle hum of the engines. She reminded herself that in a few short hours they'd be in sunny California, away from the biting chill of New York. Thomas glanced at his wife's pregnant belly, reassured by its comforting curve. Despite his calm facade, he was bracing himself for possible complications. After all, Clara was well into her second trimester, and the slightest turbulence could wreak havoc on her nerves. While he was occupied with these quiet worries, Miranda Shaw began her safety demonstration, her crisp, staccato voice echoing down the aisle. Something in Miranda's manner was off that day. Usually, she was a professional, albeit curt, presence during the safety announcements. But on this flight, she seemed particularly abrasive. She snapped at a passenger in first class who was slow to stow his carry-on. She scolded a young mother whose child was crying while she tried to fasten a seatbelt. Each time she spoke, her tone dripped with thinly veiled disdain. Though Thomas made note of it, he chalked it up to the universal truth that flight attendants often have stressful jobs. He had no clue just how venomous Miranda's frustration could become, nor the radical lengths she might go to exert her dominion over the cabin. Midway through the flight, Clara felt the first pangs of discomfort. The seatbelt sign was off, and she quietly excused herself to visit the lavatory. She hoped to stretch her legs and ease the tension in her cramped body. Thomas was about to accompany her, but she insisted she could manage. After pressing a gentle kiss to her cheek, Thomas watched her walk toward the back of the plane. Miranda, stationed in the galley, caught sight of Clara waddling carefully down the aisle. A glare flickered in the flight attendant's eyes, fueled by an inexplicable sense of irritation. At that moment, the faint beep of a passenger calling for assistance drew Miranda's attention away, and she forced her gaze off Clara. Yet a storm of resentment had already begun to gather beneath Miranda's calm veneer, one that would soon be unleashed. Clara emerged from the lavatory feeling slightly better, but as she headed back to her seat, a sharp jolt of turbulence rocked the aircraft. Startled, she lost her balance. Instinctively, she reached out and steadied herself against the seat backs on either side of the aisle. Unfortunately, she momentarily blocked Miranda, who was attempting to roll a beverage cart through the narrow space. Miranda pressed her lips together in a thin line, staring daggers at Clara. Many flight attendants might have asked politely for the passenger to move aside, but Miranda was in no mood for civility. Her voice came out in a poisonous hiss, commanding Clara to sit down immediately, even though Clara's seat was still a few rows away. Trying to remain polite, Clara mumbled an apology, explaining that the turbulence had caught her off guard. Miranda wasn't satisfied. She slapped the seat next to Clara, shouting loud enough for surrounding passengers to hear, "I said, sit down. Are you deaf?" The hostility in her words and body language sent a hush along the row of seats, and a ripple of shock coursed through the onlookers. Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she also felt the first flares of righteous indignation spark within her. She was pregnant, not helpless, and while she had initially aimed to diffuse the tension, she realized she'd done nothing to deserve such an outburst. The tension soared as Thomas, sensing the commotion, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. He swiftly maneuvered through the aisle to reach his wife, shooting a sharp glance at Miranda. "Is there a problem here?" he asked in a steady tone. Though Thomas rarely employed the commanding gravity of his judicial voice outside the courtroom, something about the way Miranda was treating Clara triggered an immediate protective instinct. Clara tried to explain what had happened, but Miranda refused to listen, brandishing her authority. Her glare fell on Thomas, assessing him in a split second. He was just another passenger, one she believed she could dominate. "Please, sir, remain in your seat," Miranda snapped, her eyes flicking dismissively over Thomas's neatly pressed suit. She presumed he was no different from any other anxious flyer who would scuttle back to compliance when confronted by crew. However, as she locked stares with him, she saw no fear, only unwavering resolve. Perhaps that was the first moment Miranda realized this passenger might be different. Yet she chose to ignore the warning signs. Instead, she grabbed Clara's elbow and attempted to guide her forcibly to an empty row, ignoring Clara's protest that her seat was up ahead. The physical contact, fleeting yet firm, marked a boundary that should never have been crossed. Shocked into silence, Clara tried to keep her balance. The sudden grip sent a jolt through her pregnant body, and her baby kicked in response to the stress. The nearby passengers, uncertain of what to do, cast worried looks. Some reached for their phones, though no one wanted to escalate the situation to the point of an in-flight altercation. Thomas's jaw tightened, and he placed a protective hand on his wife's shoulder. "She doesn't have to sit there," he said firmly. "Our seats are in row 11. We're returning to them." Miranda yanked her hand back, her chest heaving with indignation, but the worst was still to come. The beverage cart wobbled precariously as Miranda tried to jerk it forward. Another bump of turbulence rattled the plane, and Clara reflexively reached out to steady herself again. In that split second, Miranda's frustration erupted. With a sudden burst of temper, Miranda raised her hand and slapped Clara across the face. The strike was not a mere brush or an accidental knock, no. It was a deliberate, stinging blow that echoed through the stunned silence of the cabin. Passengers gasped, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to stand still. Clara's vision blurred with tears and shock, and Thomas felt as though his heart had been ripped from his chest. Every fiber of his being demanded he defend his wife, but the constraints of the airplane and the presence of other travelers forced him to keep his composure for now. Stunned into momentary inaction, Clara pressed a trembling hand to her cheek. She could feel the warmth of her own blood pumping beneath her skin, her mind torn between disbelief and outrage. That a flight attendant, someone entrusted with passenger safety, would resort to violence was beyond her comprehension. Thomas's stare hardened, and he took a slow, deliberate step between Clara and Miranda. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" he demanded, voice resonating with chilling calm. Several passengers jumped out of their seats to witness the standoff, while a few others called for assistance. Miranda, adrenaline coursing through her, seemed just as shocked by her own action. Nevertheless, her pride refused to let her apologize or step back. Shouts began to swirl up and down the aisle. A middle-aged businessman began demanding that the captain be alerted. Two college students whipped out their phones, trying to film the confrontation. A grandmother traveling to visit her grandchildren looked on with horror, tears brimming in her eyes. The tension was so palpable, it felt as though it could crack the cabin walls. Through all this, Clara's cheeks stung, but what hurt her more was the sense of betrayal. She had trusted the flight crew to protect her, yet here she was, assaulted. Miranda clung stubbornly to a misguided sense of superiority, refusing to concede that she had crossed an unforgivable line. Suddenly, the sound of rapid footfalls reached them. Another flight attendant, Joanna Martinez, appeared, her face drawn with worry. She immediately noted Clara's red cheek and Miranda's trembling posture. The look in Joanna's eyes revealed she grasped the severity of the situation. Stepping between Miranda and Thomas, she tried to de-escalate. "Everyone, please remain calm," she pleaded in a soft but urgent tone. "Let's move this to the galley and discuss what just happened." Even amid her own shock, Clara recognized the sincerity in Joanna's words. For a moment, it seemed the atmosphere might cool, but the wave of emotions that had already been unleashed was not so easily quelled. Thomas gently guided Clara to her seat, whispering reassurances. Still physically trembling, Clara sunk down, tears slipping from her eyes. A wave of nausea overtook her, and she pressed a hand to her belly. The baby stirred anxiously. Meanwhile, Miranda retreated to the galley, her thoughts scrambling to justify her actions. How had she allowed the situation to spiral so quickly? She was a professional, trained to handle emergencies, drunken passengers, and even the occasional mid-flight labor. Yet something about this pregnant woman had triggered a deep, volatile resentment. Perhaps it was the intensity of her own personal troubles, which she had tried to bury beneath her polished uniform. Or maybe it was simply a catastrophic lapse in judgment. Regardless, the damage was done. Outraged passengers began pressing their call buttons, demanding explanations. Joanna found herself inundated with pleas from all sides. She was painfully aware that a single moment of violence by a flight attendant could lead to a host of legal consequences, not to mention severe repercussions for the airline. Joanna herself was no stranger to the complexities of mid-air crises, but never before had she witnessed a colleague physically strike a passenger, let alone one who was pregnant. She grabbed the in-flight phone and contacted the captain, who listened grimly as she summarized the incident. The captain, sounding unsettled, assured Joanna that airline protocol would be followed. For now, they had no choice but to continue the flight to Los Angeles. Turning back to the aisle, Joanna realized that the rest of the journey was bound to be fraught with tension and possibly far more dramatic turns. Meanwhile, Thomas sat rigidly in seat 11C, his hand clasped around Clara's. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice trembling with concern. Clara nodded weakly, but her eyes brimmed with silent outrage. She whispered that she felt safer with him there. She didn't want to move, nor did she feel any desire to confront Miranda again. Her priority was the health of her baby and trying to stay composed. Yet, as she touched her throbbing cheek, she couldn't shake a sense of righteous anger. She had done nothing to provoke such treatment. If there was a silver lining to any of this horror, it was that she was married to a man who understood the full weight of the law. Miranda might not have realized it yet, but by striking the wife of a respected judge, she had set in motion a chain of events that would go far beyond a mid-flight confrontation. In the cockpit, Captain Lauren Hightower was locked in a tense conversation with ground control. Procedures dictated that once a crew member physically assaults a passenger, certain protocols must be activated. The airline's legal department was notified. The possibility of an emergency landing was considered, though the flight path didn't offer many convenient options. Furthermore, the day's weather reports warned of strong storms in the region. Ultimately, the decision was made to press on to Los Angeles, where law enforcement and airline officials would be waiting at the gate. The captain ended the conversation, her mind racing. She had flown commercial jets for 20 years, during which she had navigated mechanical failures and even a terrifying engine fire. But an incident involving a crew member slapping a pregnant passenger was a fiasco that could spiral into legal and media nightmares. By now, Miranda had withdrawn into the cramped confines of the galley, arms crossed defensively. Joanna approached her with trepidation, fully aware that any misstep might escalate the situation. "Miranda, what in the world happened out there?" Joanna asked, struggling to keep her tone calm. Miranda, looking as though she were teetering on the edge of hysteria, hissed that Clara had been blocking the aisle, that she almost collided with the beverage cart, that she was tired of incompetent, self-important passengers who never listened to instructions. Shocked by Miranda's callous words, Joanna resisted the urge to snap back and instead gently pointed out that there was no excuse for striking someone, least of all an expectant mother. Miranda's response was to glare at Joanna before turning away, her hands shaking. Deep down, she knew she had crossed a line. Pride, however, refused to let her admit it. As the flight dragged on, a cold, uneasy hush settled through the cabin. The usual mid-flight announcements sounded hollow in the tense atmosphere. Some passengers tried to watch movies or read, but they found themselves too distracted by the sense of impending confrontation. The seatbelt sign occasionally blinked on when they encountered turbulence, each jostle heightening the collective edginess. A few seats behind Clara and Thomas, an elderly couple whispered in urgent tones, fearful that Miranda might lash out again at someone else. The emotional tension was thick enough to taste in the recycled air. Clara, needing a distraction from her roiling thoughts, closed her eyes and tried to picture the calm hush of her living room back home. She imagined the cradle she and Thomas had set up just days ago, the little plush teddy bears waiting for their baby. The comforting image was overshadowed by the memory of Miranda's hand striking her cheek. Although her immediate physical pain was subsiding, the emotional ramifications lingered. She was not merely an aggrieved passenger, but a woman carrying new life, assaulted by someone entrusted with keeping her safe. Meanwhile, Thomas silently ruminated on the legal steps he would take once they landed. It wasn't only about personal justice. He had devoted his career to ensuring the law protected the vulnerable, and in his eyes, Miranda's action violated the most fundamental standards of human decency. Suddenly, a nervous voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have been informed that upon arrival in Los Angeles, security personnel and airline representatives will board the plane. We ask for your cooperation." The captain's voice trailed off, replaced by static. Passengers exchanged apprehensive glances. They knew the reason for the unusual announcement. Tension ramped up again, particularly near the front rows. Miranda remained out of sight, presumably in the galley, but everyone sensed the storm brewing behind the curtain. Without warning, the plane jolted in a sudden patch of turbulence, far stronger than the earlier bumps. Several passengers yelped in alarm. Clara's stomach lurched, and she clenched Thomas's hand. The overhead bins rattled ominously, and a flight attendant's recorded voice advised everyone to take their seats and fasten their belts. For a fleeting moment, the immediate threat of rough air overshadowed the confrontation. Thomas's legal calculations dissolved into raw protective instincts. His only concern was for Clara's safety. As the aircraft shuddered, the tension among the passengers merged with the fear of the storm outside, forming a single, choking sense of dread. The turbulence persisted, buffeting the plane like a toy in a child's hand. Lights flickered. People began to pray, while others clutched their seat cushions as though they could will the plane to remain steady. In row 11, Clara felt tears welling in her eyes once again. Stress hammered at her from every angle, the physical discomfort of turbulence, the emotional fallout from Miranda's strike, the anxiety about the baby. Thomas whispered words of assurance, drawing upon every bit of courage he had. Eventually, after several minutes of heart-stopping tremors, the plane eased back into relative calm. But the aftermath left nerves frayed beyond measure. As soon as the flight stabilized, a hushed argument broke out a few rows ahead. A passenger who had filmed the slap on his phone was confronting another traveler who claimed the footage should be handed over to the authorities. The man with the phone refused, muttering that he wanted to share it on social media first. The argument escalated into threats, causing further chaos. Joanna hurried down the aisle, trying to diffuse tempers. Her gaze flicked anxiously toward the galley, where Miranda still lurked, out of sight. Every time Joanna thought she had addressed one crisis, another sprang up in its place. Unexpectedly, the intercom buzzed again. "Miss Shaw to the cockpit, please," came the captain's voice. The cabin fell silent. Everyone realized they were calling Miranda. Perhaps the captain intended to question her or even relieve her of her duties for the remainder of the flight. Joanna moved to the galley, found Miranda staring at the metal cabinets with a hollow gaze. and relayed the captain's request. With forced composure, Miranda set down the coffee pot she had been clutching and made her way to the cockpit. Passengers craned their necks to see her face as she passed, but she avoided their eyes. Even as she disappeared behind the reinforced door, an undercurrent of foreboding lingered. Would the captain simply scold her, or was something more decisive about to take place? Inside the cockpit, Miranda braced herself for the inevitable reprimand, but the conversation took an unexpected turn. Captain Hightower wasted no time addressing the assault, stating bluntly that Miranda's behavior was unacceptable and had put the entire crew's reputation at stake. Miranda felt her chest tighten, her eyes pricking with tears she refused to shed in front of her superior. She tried to offer an apology, but it rang hollow even to her own ears. The captain's voice softened momentarily, asking if there were deeper issues troubling her. Miranda hesitated, grappling with a swirl of personal anguish. But instead of confessing her troubles, she simply shook her head. The captain, likely aware there was more to the story, exhaled deeply. "I'm relieving you of your duties for the rest of the flight," she declared. Miranda felt her stomach drop. She'd never been in such disgrace. Still, the looming confrontation upon landing overshadowed even this humiliation. When Miranda emerged from the cockpit, the look on her face told the entire cabin she had been stripped of authority. Some passengers appeared relieved, while others glowered with contempt. Clara, who still cradled her sore cheek, couldn't bring herself to look at Miranda. Thomas, on the other hand, fixed the disgraced flight attendant with a steely gaze, his professional mask of composure slipping. A flicker of regret darted across Miranda's features as she noticed the anger and pain in their eyes, but pride sealed her lips. She retreated to an empty jump seat where she strapped herself in, determined to ride out the flight in silent isolation. Time moved at a snail's pace. Passengers attempted to return to normalcy. Some turned to the in-flight entertainment. Others tried to read or rest. But an unspoken tension hung in the air. Whispers traveled through the rows. She actually slapped her. They called the captain. Law enforcement will be waiting. The cabin became a hothouse of speculation, each rumor more sensational than the last. In row 11, Clara shifted uncomfortably. She could almost feel the baby picking up on her stress, delivering restless kicks. Thomas reached over, placed a reassuring hand on her stomach, and mouthed a silent promise. "It will be okay." In truth, Thomas was wrestling with anger that he rarely allowed himself to feel. All his professional training taught him to remain calm, fair, and impartial. Yet here was a blatant case of violence, and the victim was none other than his pregnant wife. He couldn't help but imagine how swiftly he'd issue a legal consequence if Miranda were standing in his courtroom. He forced himself to take measured breaths, reminding himself that due process would apply here. She would have her day before the law, and while flight attendants have the power to enforce safety rules, they do not have the right to commit assault. This was not some minor scuffle. It was a serious offense, one that might lead to significant legal and professional fallout for Miranda Shaw. At last, the flight began its descent into Los Angeles. The usual flurry of landing preparations transpired, albeit overshadowed by the tension. Tray tables clicked shut, seats returned to their upright positions, and the anxious hush intensified. The plane's landing gear dropped with a mechanical whine, and the city lights of L.A. winked below the wing. Clara exhaled with relief that the flight was almost over, but her relief was tainted by dread, knowing they were about to face a maelstrom of legal and emotional reckoning once they touched the tarmac. The touchdown was smooth, a welcome contrast to the turbulence they had faced earlier. A mixture of applause and muted sighs filled the cabin as the plane slowed and taxied to the gate. Almost immediately, the sense of anticipation surged. Passengers leaned into the aisle, keen to see who would board the aircraft. Clara took a final look at Thomas, who squeezed her hand in silent solidarity. They felt united, yet uncertain about what might happen next. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the plane door opened. Instead of the usual cheerful gate crew, 2 airport police officers and a stern-faced airline representative stepped aboard. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The officers had a quiet word with the captain, then turned to face the passengers. One officer cleared his throat and addressed the entire plane. "We're here to investigate an incident that occurred in flight. We request the cooperation of all passengers who witnessed it or have relevant information." The hush deepened, and numerous hands shot up, even those who had only glimpsed part of the altercation. The officer invited passengers to disembark in an orderly fashion, while requesting that Clara, Thomas, Miranda, and a few key witnesses remain on the plane. Clara braced herself, adjusting her seatbelt again, even though the plane was already at the gate. She noticed a pair of paramedics waiting just outside the door, presumably in case she needed medical attention. Her cheeks still throbbed faintly, a persistent reminder of the outrage she had suffered. Thomas stood, offering her his hand. He took a moment to inform the officers that his wife was pregnant and needed to remain seated for a moment. The officers nodded, their expressions shifting to concern. They were clearly aware that a pregnant passenger was at the center of this ugly incident. Miranda, meanwhile, remained strapped into her jump seat, eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't need an announcement to know she would be questioned. A swirl of panic, shame, and indignation coursed through her. She had never been in serious legal trouble before, fired from a job or disciplined by a supervisor, perhaps, but never facing potential criminal charges. The flight had ended, but the real turbulence in Miranda's life was just beginning. Once most of the passengers exited, the officers asked Thomas, Clara, Miranda, and the handful of witnesses to follow them into the jet bridge. Joanna Martinez, who had tried so hard to maintain order, also joined them, offering moral support to Clara and Thomas. The airline representative, identified by his badge as Ronald Pierce, explained they would move to a nearby lounge area for statements. Clara's legs felt shaky, but Thomas guided her gently. She was grateful for his steady presence. Miranda trailed behind, each step feeling heavier than the last. She could almost sense the glares burning into her from the other witnesses. In a private lounge, chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. The officers guided each individual to a seat, then began a methodical round of questioning. Clara recounted her version of events, voice trembling as she described the moment Miranda's hand connected with her face. Thomas added his perspective, emphasizing that Miranda had shown aggression long before the slap occurred. Witnesses offered corroborating details, some even showing videos they captured. The officers listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances that suggested Miranda's situation was dire. When it was Miranda's turn, she fidgeted with her uniform, her eyes darting around the room. She mumbled about the stress of the job, about how Clara had caused a disruption and ignored instructions. A hush fell as she tried to justify her actions. But as soon as she reached the part about physically striking Clara, her voice faltered. She appeared to realize that no matter the stress or provocation, she had crossed a line with no lawful justification. The officers asked pointed questions, peeling back every layer of Miranda's story. By the time she finished, her shoulders sagged with defeat. Ronald Pierce, the airline representative, then stepped forward. His words were directed to all parties, though it was clear the apology was primarily for Clara's benefit. He expressed regret on behalf of the airline, stating such behavior would not be tolerated. He promised that the airline would cover any medical costs, offer compensation for trauma, and launch a full internal investigation. As Clara listened, she saw how hollow the words seemed. Compensation might help, but it wouldn't erase the humiliation of being slapped mid-flight. nor would it quell her righteous anger. Thomas's lips pressed into a thin line, but he kept silent for now. After lengthy discussions, the officers stepped outside to confer, leaving Miranda seated alone in the quiet room. The witnesses had been asked to wait in an adjacent corridor. Clara remained in her chair, softly sipping from a bottle of water provided by the paramedics. Thomas stood near the window, gazing at the bustling LAX runway. Airplanes taxied in the distance, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding in that small lounge. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what legal recourse was taken, she'd never be quite the same after this experience. The officers returned, their expressions somber. They addressed Miranda first, informing her that she was being taken into custody on suspicion of assault. Miranda's face went pale. She offered no resistance as they led her away in handcuffs, her gaze fixed on the floor. Gasps escaped from Joanna and the remaining witnesses. Even though Miranda had inflicted harm, the sight of a once respected flight attendant in restraints was jarring. Clara watched, heart pounding. As the reality set in, Miranda was going to face the consequences. However, the day's revelations were far from over. As Miranda disappeared through the door, one of the officers lingered, rummaging through some notes. He then turned to Thomas and Clara, politely asking them to follow him to a different office for an official statement. Clara's brow furrowed in confusion. Hadn't they already given their statements? Thomas exchanged a look with his wife, then complied. They found themselves guided down a series of corridors until they reached an office with a large glass window overlooking the runway. The officer invited them to sit, then quietly cleared his throat. "Judge Martin," he began, addressing Thomas with the professional courtesy due his title, "there's another matter we need to discuss, related to an ongoing investigation involving Miss Shaw." Thomas felt a jolt of surprise. He hadn't expected his role as a judge to be acknowledged so candidly. The officer explained that local authorities had flagged Miranda Shaw for a separate investigation. Although the details were confidential, it involved allegations of misconduct that stretched beyond a single flight. The officer's tone was cautious, but it was clear he believed Thomas's judicial experience might be relevant. Clara glanced at her husband, alarmed. It was as though a hidden layer of the story was peeling back, revealing deeper complexities they hadn't anticipated. Something about this development stirred a protective instinct in Thomas. While he had no intention of mixing his personal life with his judicial duties, he recognized that Miranda might be entangled in a broader pattern of abuse or misconduct. And that knowledge only fueled his resolve. This wasn't just about a slap. It could be part of something bigger, more insidious. Meanwhile, Clara, struggling with fatigue and emotional exhaustion, found herself wishing she could simply go home, bury the trauma, and focus on her unborn child. But life, it appeared, had cast them both in a larger play, with roles they could not easily abandon. They spent another hour in that office, clarifying their statements and responding to questions about Miranda's behavior during the flight, her demeanor, and any clues that might tie into the other allegations. The revelation that Miranda might have a history of misconduct sent shockwaves through Clara. She wondered if other passengers or staff had suffered similarly, and if they too had been reluctant to come forward. By the time the officer thanked them and escorted them out, both Clara and Thomas felt drained, as though they had lived through an entire saga in a single day. Little did they know the saga wasn't finished yet. Outside the lounge they found Joanna waiting anxiously. Her eyes lit up when she saw Clara and Thomas, and she rushed over, relief visible on her face. She asked repeatedly if Clara felt okay, if she needed medical attention, if she had any immediate symptoms that might harm the baby. Clara assured her she was fine, physically at least. Joanna then apologized on behalf of the entire flight crew, tears glistening in her eyes as she admitted she felt responsible for not intervening sooner. Though Clara felt a lingering bitterness about the incident, she couldn't blame Joanna personally. In fact, she was grateful to at least one flight attendant who had tried to do the right thing. Thomas suggested they find a quiet spot to decompress. Joanna recommended a little-known airport lounge reserved for crew, but sometimes made available to distressed passengers. With Ronald Pierce's permission, the three of them slipped inside, finding plush chairs, soft lighting, and relative tranquility compared to the chaotic terminal. A wave of relief flooded Clara as she sank into a seat, though her mind still buzzed with unresolved tension. Thomas sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. Joanna hovered nearby, as though determined to protect Clara now that Miranda was no longer an immediate threat. A short time later, the lounge door swung open. To their surprise, the airport police officer from before entered. He wore a guarded expression, but something about his demeanor suggested a slight shift in the situation. He addressed Clara and Thomas directly, explaining that Miranda had been booked on assault charges and would likely face additional investigations. However, because of Miranda's track record and the seriousness of assaulting a pregnant woman, bail might be complicated, and media attention was already swirling. The officer warned them that news outlets had gotten wind of the incident. Someone had undoubtedly leaked the story, perhaps one of the passengers who caught the slap on video. Clara felt her stomach twist. The last thing she wanted was to become the face of a viral story about airline violence. Thomas's reaction was measured. A public ordeal could endanger his impartial reputation as a judge, potentially inviting scrutiny from the press that might question his rulings on unrelated cases. More importantly, Clara's privacy and well-being were at stake. The officer assured them that victims have the right to remain private and recommended seeking legal counsel if the media harassment escalated. Thomas nodded, taking mental notes. No matter what decisions he made in the coming days, he was resolute that Clara's health and peace of mind came first. While they discussed potential next steps, a flight crew manager approached them. She carried a formal letter from the airline's headquarters, expressing regret and promising a thorough internal review. It offered an immediate upgrade to first-class travel for any future flights, along with coverage for medical checkups to ensure the baby's well-being. Clara accepted the letter, but the gesture felt oddly superficial compared to what she had endured. She realized that while corporate apologies might soothe the airline's public image, they did little to address the deeper emotional scars she now carried. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas and Clara finally made their way to the exit, accompanied by Joanna. They passed through the bustling terminal, which looked the same as ever, full of travelers racing to catch flights or greet loved ones. Yet for Clara, the experience of stepping off a plane had been forever changed. They eventually hailed a cab to their hotel, where Thomas had reservations for the original trip. Clara sat in the back seat, leaning her head against the window. Streetlights whirred by, but her mind was miles away, replaying the moment of the slap, the sting, and the aftermath. They arrived at the hotel, a well-known chain, Hilton Los Angeles Airport, shortly before midnight. The polished floors and glossy reception desks were a stark contrast to the day's turmoil. The check-in process felt surreal as the clerk asked routine questions: ID, credit card, length of stay, completely unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Once in their room, Clara collapsed onto the bed, her body yearning for rest. Yet sleep remained elusive, her mind churning with emotional debris. Thomas changed into more comfortable clothes, then sat beside her, gently massaging her back. With unspoken understanding, they acknowledged that the day's events might haunt them for some time. Morning brought no immediate relief. The local news channels blared in the hotel lobby, featuring sensational headlines: "Flight attendant assaults pregnant passenger." Some segments displayed shaky phone footage of the incident. Clara cringed, imagining her own shocked expression recorded for the world to see. Thomas switched off the TV, whispering that he would handle any press inquiries. He quickly placed calls to colleagues back home, ensuring they had the facts. It was a necessary defensive measure for his judicial career, but it also helped set the record straight about what truly happened on that flight. Mid-morning, a soft knock echoed through their hotel room door. Clara tensed, fearing it might be a reporter. To her relief, it was Joanna. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but her presence offered a strange comfort. She carried a bag of pastries and 2 cups of herbal tea. Setting them down on the small table, Joanna explained that she wanted to make sure Clara was doing okay. The airline had demanded she keep quiet about details, but Joanna refused to ignore her own conscience. She felt it was crucial to support Clara, even if just with a friendly visit. Over tea, the 3 of them spoke in hushed tones about the aftermath. Joanna described the mood among the rest of the crew: shock, anger, and worry that the entire flight staff might be unjustly tarnished by Miranda's actions. Clara expressed gratitude for Joanna's help, but a deeper question gnawed at her. Why did Miranda do it? Joanna hesitated before revealing that Miranda had been battling personal demons, an ailing parent, financial woes, and a recent heartbreak. None of it excused her behavior, but it painted a picture of someone on the edge, teetering under pressure until she snapped. Clara felt a flicker of empathy, tempered by the lingering pain in her cheek. Later that afternoon, Thomas received a call from a local prosecutor. He was informed that because of the severity of the assault and the presence of multiple credible witnesses, Miranda's arraignment would happen quickly. Although Thomas was not the presiding judge for Miranda's case, the prosecutor valued his perspective as a witness. She also warned that the defense might try to argue mitigating circumstances based on Miranda's personal hardships. Thomas felt torn. As a judge, he understood the complexities of the legal system, but as Clara's husband, he wanted full accountability. The dissonance between his roles weighed heavily on his mind. In the days that followed, the media cycle intensified. News vans clustered outside the courthouse when Miranda was brought in for arraignment. The local tabloids latched onto the dramatic storyline: pregnant victim married to esteemed judge. If the flight attendant had known Clara's husband was a judge, would she have dared to slap her? Pundits speculated. Talk shows invited airline safety experts to discuss flight attendants' duties. Social media erupted with opinions, condemnation, and sensational spins on the story. Clara tried her best to tune it all out, focusing on her well-being and the life growing inside her. But each new wave of coverage chipped away at her peace. One morning, Clara and Thomas decided to take a walk on a quiet stretch of beach to clear their heads. The salty Pacific breeze and the soothing sound of crashing waves offered a brief respite from the media firestorm. As they strolled hand in hand, Clara felt her unborn child's gentle kicks, a reminder of life's promise amid chaos. Thomas paused, gazing at her with love and concern. "We'll get through this," he said softly. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, but she nodded. In that quiet moment, they felt united, determined to face whatever lay ahead. Unbeknownst to them, Miranda's situation was unraveling on the other side of the city. Her airline had suspended her indefinitely, without pay, pending the investigation's outcome. She was released on bail, courtesy of a family member, but the terms confined her movement within a limited radius. Media outlets chased her for interviews, but she declined, sequestered in a small apartment on the outskirts of LA. She spent her days replaying the incident, grappling with shame, anger, and an all-consuming anxiety about her future. Nights brought nightmares where she was trapped in an airplane cabin, forever trying to escape the consequences of her actions. Not long after, a hearing date was set. Clara and Thomas debated whether they should attend in person. On one hand, Clara felt anxious at the thought of encountering Miranda again, yet she also yearned for closure. Thomas left the decision up to Clara, promising to support her either way. Ultimately, Clara chose to face her attacker, hoping to find some sense of empowerment in the process. The day arrived with an air of gravitas. They entered the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid the press, stepping into a world Thomas knew all too well: the echo of footsteps on polished floors, the solemn hush of the corridors. Inside the courtroom, Miranda stood at the defendant's table, her once proud posture diminished. Her lawyer whispered frantically, flipping through documents. On the prosecution's side, a poised attorney laid out the evidence, passenger testimonies, video footage, and the testimony of Captain Hightower and Joanna. Clara sat behind the prosecutor, her heart pounding at the sight of Miranda's hunched shoulders. When asked to identify the person who assaulted her, Clara's voice trembled, but she spoke clearly. It was her. She pointed at Miranda, her hand shaking but resolute. Miranda's lawyer attempted a mitigation strategy, citing her personal hardships, but the prosecution underlined that no circumstance justified violence against a pregnant passenger. A hush fell over the courtroom when the judge, coincidentally an acquaintance of Thomas from the legal community, made her preliminary remarks. She emphasized the severity of the charge and indicated that, given the evidence, the case would proceed to trial unless Miranda accepted a plea. Miranda's lawyer requested a recess to confer. During the recess, Clara found herself in the hallway, leaning against a marble column to steady her nerves. Thomas stood protectively by her side. As she took a moment to breathe, Miranda unexpectedly emerged from the courtroom, escorted by her lawyer. Their eyes met. For a fleeting second, Clara saw a torrent of regret and desperation in Miranda's gaze. Before anyone could speak, Miranda's lawyer gently pulled her away. Clara remained rooted in place, heart racing. Though the confrontation was brief, it shook her in a way she hadn't anticipated. Miranda seemed so lost, a far cry from the raging flight attendant who had struck her. When the hearing resumed, Miranda's lawyer announced they would not proceed to trial. Instead, Miranda intended to plead guilty to a lesser charge of misdemeanor battery with special circumstances, hoping to avoid a felony on her record. It was a strategic move: spare her a lengthy trial, reduce potential jail time, and perhaps secure mandatory counseling. The judge accepted the plea arrangement pending a formal sentencing hearing. As the session ended, Clara felt a swirl of relief and unresolved tension. On one hand, justice seemed to be served, at least in part. On the other, she recognized that no legal outcome could erase the trauma entirely. In the days following, an eerie calm settled in. The media frenzy subsided, replaced by other sensational stories. Clara and Thomas returned home, eager to resume a semblance of normal life. Doctors' appointments reassured them that the baby was healthy, and each new ultrasound image became a symbol of hope, reminding them that life continued forward no matter the chaos. Yet memories of the flight lingered like a faint bruise, occasionally throbbing at unexpected moments. When the official sentencing day arrived, Clara and Thomas decided to appear, not out of malice, but for closure. The courtroom was smaller this time, and fewer reporters were present. Miranda sat with her lawyer, head bowed. The judge pronounced the sentence: 12 months of probation, mandatory anger management therapy, community service, and restitution, including covering all medical or counseling expenses Clara might need. Miranda, tears slipping down her cheeks, offered a quiet apology to Clara, her first direct acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Clara listened, her emotions tangled. Ultimately, she accepted the apology, recognizing that while forgiveness might be a stretch, letting go of bitterness was crucial for her own peace of mind. As they left the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, a stark contrast to the somber proceedings inside. Thomas gripped Clara's hand, Both of them felt the weight of finality, that a chapter in their lives was closing. The path to healing wouldn't be immediate or simple, but they sensed they were stepping into a new phase. In an unspoken agreement, they decided that the best revenge was to live well, to treasure each other, and to raise their child in an environment free from resentment and fear. Word reached them through the grapevine that Miranda had taken her anger management courses seriously and was planning to relocate to a smaller town to care for her ailing parent. Whether or not she returned to the skies remained uncertain. For Clara, the ordeal reinforced her belief that you never truly know the burdens others carry. While she would never condone Miranda's actions, she found it in her heart to hope the woman could find redemption. After all, karma had already visited Miranda in a form more potent than any physical retaliation. She lost her job, her freedom, and her dignity in a single catastrophic moment. In the months that followed, Clara and Thomas welcomed their beautiful baby girl into the world. Holding that tiny life in her arms, Clara felt a rush of gratitude and protection. She also felt a profound sense of perspective. The slap that once dominated her thoughts was now eclipsed by the miracle of motherhood. Friends and family gathered around, celebrating new beginnings and offering well wishes. Occasionally, a curious acquaintance would ask about the infamous flight and whether Clara harbored bitterness. She would simply respond that she was focusing on her family and on the future, on creation, not destruction. As for Judge Thomas Martin, he discovered his own sense of renewed purpose in the courtroom. His experience in the meltdown at 30,000 feet heightened his empathy for victims of violence and injustice. It reminded him that the law he upheld wasn't a distant set of rules, but a living force shaping real people's lives. On more than one occasion, he caught himself recalling Clara's tearful face on the flight, and it fueled a deep resolve to handle each case with the same fairness, compassion, and resolve. He'd shown his wife on that tumultuous day. Though the world moved on to new headlines, the lessons endured for everyone involved. For Clara, the experience stood as a reminder that adversity can strike at the most unexpected times, even in a place as mundane as an airplane cabin. For Miranda, it served as a stark wake-up call, compelling her to confront personal demons she'd kept buried for too long. And for Thomas, it rekindled his commitment to justice, both at home and in the courthouse. Life continued, punctuated by the daily joys and challenges of new parenthood, but a thread of resilience now wove through Clara and Thomas's relationship, binding them closer than ever. In the end, it was a story of karmic retribution and personal growth. Miranda had lashed out in a moment of frustration and cruelty, only to face the full force of the law, social condemnation, and her own conscience. Clara, once victimized, emerged stronger, buoyed by her husband's unwavering support and the luminous promise of her unborn child. Though no one could have predicted the wild twists, an unforeseen outburst at cruising altitude, a subsequent arrest, or the complicated backstory that emerged, fate had orchestrated these events in a bizarre ballet of consequences and revelations. Years later, in moments of reflection, Clara would recall the events of Flight 972 with both sadness and a curious sense of gratitude. Sadness for the fear and humiliation she endured, but gratitude for the deeper bond it forged between her and Thomas, and for the clarity it brought to her own values. She never boarded a plane again without a pang of anxiety, but each time she remembered the hard-fought lesson: adversity is unpredictable, and the line between safe routine and calamity can be perilously thin. Yet within that chaos, we discover the strength we never knew we possessed. As the chapters of their lives continued to unfold, the incident remained a stark reminder. A single choice, a single lapse of control can set in motion a ripple effect that alters countless lives. It challenged assumptions about authority and accountability. Even flight attendants, entrusted with passenger safety, could succumb to violence under strain, and it underscored the moral imperative to stand against injustice, no matter how unexpected or uncomfortable the circumstances. Indeed, a routine flight had revealed universal truths about courage, compassion, and the consequences that befall those who choose cruelty over understanding. In the quiet moments, long after the final court hearing and the swirl of media attention, Thomas and Clara would sometimes share a knowing look. Their child, now a lively toddler, giggled and toddled around, blissfully unaware of her parents' turbulent past. And that, Clara realized, was the best outcome she could have hoped for, to shield her daughter from the darkness of that day, to pave a path bright with love and security. The memory of Miranda's slap still stung, but it was softened by the unstoppable momentum of life, moving onward. Indeed, what was once a painful memory had become a cornerstone of fortitude for the family. Thus, the saga concluded in a swirl of accountability, healing, and renewal. Clara Martin, the pregnant passenger who had been brutally struck by a stewardess, found her voice in the halls of justice. Miranda Shaw, the flight attendant who made a disastrous choice in a moment of rage, faced the karmic storm she had unleashed. Judge Thomas Martin, whose measured hand guided the aftermath, reinforced the truth that even outside the courtroom, justice can and must prevail. Together, they formed the mosaic of a story that taught everyone who heard it that no wrongdoing goes unpunished, and no test goes without offering a chance at redemption. To this day, travelers passing through John F. Kennedy International Airport might never realize that one of the most dramatic in-flight altercations of recent memory began within its bustling gates. They hurry to their flights, weighed down by their own anxieties and aspirations. The terminal has seen it all: joyful reunions, tearful goodbyes, and the unstoppable march of fate weaving countless stories. Clara and Thomas's story was but one thread in that vast tapestry. Yet for those who witnessed or heard of Flight 972's extraordinary events, it stands out as a potent reminder that life's most pivotal moments often arrive unannounced, with swift, startling force. In reflecting upon the labyrinthine twists and turns, Clara realized that the resolution was as complete as any real-life story could be. Miranda faced the consequences of her actions, both legally and personally. Clara found healing through courage, justice, and the unwavering love of Thomas. And the world, for better or worse, kept spinning, delivering new challenges and wonders with each revolution. Through it all, a single truth rang clear: in the face of cruelty, empathy and integrity can and will prevail, lighting the path toward understanding and renewal. Thank you for journeying with us through this dramatic tale of hidden tensions, shocking violence, and ultimate justice. Sometimes, life's most profound lessons strike when we least expect them on an ordinary flight, among unsuspecting passengers. In the end, every piece of the puzzle revealed a powerful reminder that compassion and resilience can defy cruelty, and that the scales of justice, though sometimes slow, do indeed balance. If you found yourself enthralled by Clara's perseverance, Thomas's unwavering resolve, and the stunning impact of karmic retribution, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with friends who love a compelling story, and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement fuels our mission to bring you more riveting tales that captivate the heart and awaken the imagination. We appreciate every moment you spent with us and look forward to sharing more enthralling stories soon. Safe travels, and until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and remember that what happens at 30, feet can change.